Hello, my name is Mercedes Afitores and I work for Interreg. As you know, we had foreseen to organize the event of bringing territoriality to Interreg some weeks ago, but due to the health crisis and the state of emergency that we are going through, we in Interreg decided to cancel this event. However, we wanted to react as soon as possible and to organize an online event in order to give you a response to those questions that you have related to functional areas and to territorial skills that will lead you to prepare your new programming period. I would like also to explain that this first session, the session of notions on functional areas and territorial skills, will be more of academic and theoretical, which afterwards will lead us to a more practical questions. Okay, I will also like to share with you some concepts on the different definitions of functional areas. Let's see if I can share with you the screen. There we go. Yes, we can. Here's the different concepts that appears of functional areas. You know in your orientation papers that most of you had this concept of functional area that is quite new for this programming period. Here we had some examples on what is a functional area for cross-border programs, territorial cross-border programs, what's the concept for maritime cross-border programs, and also for transnational programs. They're very similar concepts, but they are considering the difference of the areas. We had some examples from the Spain, France, Andorra program, the CBC Baltic Sea area, and the Danube Transnationals. But right now we would like you, Nathalie, coming from the European Commission, DG Regio unit, a cross-border unit. Why are we here? Why do you think it's important for us to discuss territoriality?
Okay, thank you very much, Mercedes. First of all, can I say that I hope everybody is well at home, coping with the circumstances that we are living and working under. Not easy every day, but of course the health of everyone comes first, and we have to keep safe and keep home. I also wanted to thank you and your colleagues in Interreg for reacting rapidly to these circumstances and to making it possible to have this discussion on territoriality through alternative ways after the meeting in Leuven was cancelled. I really appreciate that. So indeed, why are we talking about territoriality right now? Certainly from DG Regio's point of view, we would very much like the future programs to be to take more into account the territories on which they operate and the territories which they are supposed to improve through the ERDF financing. We feel, particularly in this cross-border context, having worked a lot the last 5 years on all sorts of aspects of cross-border interaction, and not only cooperation but interaction, we do feel strongly that it's probably not the most effective way to work if we constantly focus on administrative boundaries, such as, for instance, the NUTS 3 area. We really need to recognize where the interactions are taking place if we want to have an impact in improving these interactions, thereby making the lives of our businesses and citizens in border regions better. And I think the same applies maybe to a less extent to the transnational programs, where again, looking at a certain space, maybe sometimes there is a need to focus a little bit more on certain territories inside those spaces. So we really feel that this is not necessarily reflected so well in existing programs, and we would like that to change. But in order to change that, we of course need to engage with the programs. Needless to say, the fact that we also have a smaller budget Although, of course, now we also hear, all of us, that the financial framework for the future will be revised dramatically to take account of the COVID pandemic. So we don't know anymore, but the basis that we've been working to is that we would have a slightly lower budget, and we need to have find ways to have more impact. So our point of view is that let's look at the territories we want to change. Let's look at the assets. Let's look at the needs and possible barriers and obstacles, that we really understand those territories. And then we can come back maybe later with you on how we operationalize the idea of looking at the territories. But if we talk about health or education or transport, whatever, we might identify within the programs some areas which are what we call functional areas, which I hope the two experts will shed some light on, Eduardo and Jean. So let's look at the concepts. Let's think about what we mean by these interactions and how we can improve those interactions to improve life in those territories. And then in a second stage, revisit this idea with the more operational glasses on, and how we make that possible via the programs. Okay, thank you, Mercedes.
Finally, territorial cooperation will become really territorial with these premises, right? I think this is the aim. So thank you very much. And now we will go to speak with our guests. Thank you. Let's introduce Professor Eduardo Medeiros. He is a geography professor and integrated researcher in Lisbon University Institute.
Thank you, Mercedes. And I'd like to thank Interact and the European Commission for inviting me to this interesting event. So I will make a presentation to present 10-factor criteria to delimit a cross-border area. And why is this so important? Well, I show you here the current limitation of the Interreg programs. And one can question this limitation. For instance, is also within territorial cross-border cooperation area? Well, maybe it's not. Maybe this is not the best limitation using these current administrative limits. Of course, we can use these criteria that the Commission proposes to delimit cross-border area, which for them is, and I agree, a 25-kilometer buffer area from both sides of the border area. But if you use these criteria, we will exclude very important players in cross-border cooperation, namely in many regional capitals. Of course, this is not an easy exercise to found a common ground to define a cross-border area. If you look at academia, many studies follow this criteria of administrative boundaries. This is an example of a NUTS 3 that is used by one academic to delimit this cross-border area between France and Spain. Well, others use these municipalities, also interesting criteria. Another interesting criteria, which is the center of this discussion, is the use of these cross-border functional areas. This is an example, probably the best most eloquent example of a cross-border functional area in Europe between Lille and Courtrai. Here, this is a very interesting map because you don't even see the border here, because this is so integrated cross-border area. Also, you know, certain academics, they don't agree that these administrative limits are most adequate, so they select something in between. It's neither a NUTS 3, nor a NUTS 2, nor municipalities, it's something. So this is not easy. And even if you take the case of the very known border between Mexico and the United States, you can see that normally this border area is considered to be a buffer zone of 50 kilometers from both sides of the border, which actually is very close to the limits of the border counties. But many interactions actually extend far more than 150 kilometers, as many studies have shown. So what I propose is that you shouldn't have just one criteria. You should have multiple criteria, at least 10 factors, that you can select in a tailor-made and flexible way, which should be adapted to each case study. Because in certain border areas, you don't find some of these criteria, but you find others. In certain areas, cross-border areas, you find that some of these criteria are very strong, and in others, they aren't very strong. So it will be flexible. You know, this includes data, because in the end, as Nathalie Vachel will tell everybody in the Interreg programs, you need to produce results and impacts. And how can you evaluate this without having data? If you use just municipality data, you don't have enough data to do this. So also the cross-border areas, functional areas is very important, including the spatial criteria, which is very much linked to the demographic criteria, which includes cross-border commuting. Of course, there is three very interlinked criteria, which is the cultural, historic, institutional. So we all know that these linkages, these cultural linkages, these institutional linkages, and historical linkages, they vary all across Europe. And if they are very strong, if these networks are already established, they need to be taken into consideration. An important factor also economic factor, which includes cross-border commerce, but also the existing implementation of cross-border programs like Interreg, where these linkages are already being established for many years in many programs. And also three other interlinked factors, which are the social, infrastructural, and environmental, in which, in simple terms, you need to take into consideration existing cross-border services that are used by persons on the other side of the border area, and, for instance, the existence of natural protected areas. So if you go to the central concept of this event, you know, for me as a geographer, cross-border functional areas, not just cross-border, are a very important concept. And for me, they are defined by three very important words. You know, you need to have a set of linkages. You need to have a bounded space, a geographical area. You need to have a set of linkages or connections. And then you need to have some interactions between these connections. But also, probably the key word is interdependencies, because you need to have some dependencies, for instance, from people that work from the other side of the border. In the case of Luxembourg, there is a lot of interdependence between people that work outside Luxembourg to make the economy of and many services in Luxembourg to work. So how do we define these bounded spaces? Well, take a very recent study from the European Commission, Joint Research Center, which they identified a lot of these geographical areas, these bounded spaces where these linkages, these interactions and these interdependencies are very strong. Let's take the case here, for instance, of this metropolitan border area, which is of Oslo, which is these interactions are very strong. But if one analyzes functional areas, you need to take into consideration the territorial scale, because if you go into more detail, you actually can see that these interactions, these linkages, these interdependencies, they actually touch the border area here in Sweden. There are many commuters that commute on a daily basis to the Oslo metropolitan area from certain counties that are located in Sweden. So you can use this data to identify cross-border functional areas. Of course, if you go to a different territorial scale, the more European scale, if you use the criteria from ESPON studies, which identify functional urban areas or FUAs all across Europe, you identify a few of them that are very close to the border at this territorial scale, of course. And here you can find in Scandinavia just one, which is links this famous triangle between Oslo, Karlstad, and Gothenburg, and maybe two here in Iberian Peninsula. But there are certain border areas which you don't find, you know, enough data to identify cross-border functional areas. So this is important criteria. It's not the only one. So for instance, it's very important, as I said, to have data. So as much as possible, if you can align with existing administrative border areas, it's important because then you find data to evaluate the programs. Also, if you have cultural linkages, language is a very important cultural element that you take into account. In certain border areas, you find population that speaks the same language of a country on the other side of the border, like here the Hungarian-speaking people that live in Romania. There are more examples. So you have areas in which cross-border intensity is very strong, which because it has been implemented from a formal way since the mid-1950s, for instance, in the Nordic countries, in the western, northwestern parts of Europe. So networks are there, they are operating, as well as cross-border entities, for instance, which are spread all across Europe. Of course, you cannot just take all the area, because many parts of these areas of cross-border entities, they are not very much connected with cross-border problems. But you need to take them in consideration. They are there. There are GTCs, there are regions, working communities, and many of these cross-border entities operating for many years now. And also, it's important to take into consideration the existing cross-border services which are working on the other side of the border, as we all know. Actually, this recent study from ESPON shows that there are far more of these cross-border public services than I personally expected. And if they exist, they need to be used to delimit these cross-border areas, as well as existing natural protected areas that are being implemented in a common way from both sides of the border. So if they extend a lot, all these areas should be included as territories to manage cross-border cooperation. I was also told to speak a little bit about transnational cooperation, but before that, I give 2 examples. If we apply these 10 factors, into 2 specific cross-border areas in Europe, the 2 of them that I know better, the Spanish and Portuguese cross-border area, and also the south part of the Swedish-Norwegian cross-border program. What I did here is to use these first and foremost, these existing connections between both sides of the border in cross-border projects. So these rose lines, they identify the location of the main partners of a project. Is not necessarily the location of the project itself, but the location of the main partners. And what we can see in both examples is that the main players in cross-border cooperation have been, especially since the 3rd Interreg, the regional capitals. It's where you have the universities, it's where you have the administrative capacity, you have the financial capacity, you have the institutional capacity, you have the capability to gain projects in a very competitive and bureaucratic Interreg and EU cohesion policy system. So this is, in fact, what I say is that the cross-border cooperation area is the area where actors want to cooperate or can cooperate. And these flows, they show the areas where this cross-border cooperation is more intense. Of course, you can also find some cross-border functional areas. Here, there's one between Porto and Coruña, which is a very intense cross-border cooperation and cross-border commuting. The same a little bit here in less intense way between Faro and Seville, and even a little bit less between Évora and Mérida. Also, if you look at the cross-border functional areas here, as we can see in previous maps, you can only find one here between Oslo, Gothenburg, and Karlstad. All the rest, all this area, this cross-border commuting is very, very, very low. So you cannot find cross-border functional areas, but we have some protected natural areas, which you can find here in the north, and also a few in the Portuguese and Spanish case. So going now into the transnational cooperation, is it possible to use functional areas as a criteria to delimit these transnational areas where if you go to the geographical concept as we know it, these bounded spaces where these interactions, linkages, interdependencies are very strong, you can see that this is very large territories. You take the example here of the Danube macro region and transnational program. So it's a good example, but you can actually find some points of contact, as my colleague Jean Perny will speak a little bit about this. Some flows, some urban connectivities. You have the river, which acts as something that connects the region, which you can find to tackle similar problems, and also you can see the examples of the connections of projects in several of these transnational programs. You take the case of the Sudoeste, which is a program that not only takes the territory in Spain, but also the south of France. And this is an example of the linkages of project linkages between only the Portuguese and Spanish partners in this 3rd programming period. You can see how many connections are here, which provides some idea of the networking that is operating in these transnational programs. So thank you for allowing me to speak in this interesting event.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. I got one note here, and you said functional areas is the area where people want to cooperate. And I think this is truly important for this territorial cooperation that we are preparing for next programming period. I don't know if some of my colleagues maybe have a question or some need of any kind of clarification.
Yes, I think one very important question. Professor Medeiros, what would you recommend to the programs, not being a special planners, where they could start looking for those functional areas? What do you think? What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, first of all, I would recommend, before going to functional areas, before they start to elaborate a program, the next programming period, understand that cross-border cooperation is something specific, and that the Commission is doing a very good job in identifying existing cross-border barriers, obstacles. So the first thing from a thematical point of view is to identify where these barriers are more persistent and try to align the program to first and foremost to reduce these barriers. Second, if I would give some advice to delimit these border areas, yes, functional areas are very important, but the first thing that I would do is try to look at the past experience, is to see where the programs, where the actors are cooperating, and try to see these linkages, these cross-border linkages from projects, in which are the areas or locations where this cross-border cooperation is more intense, and then go and try to identify these cross-border commuting areas, these cross-border functional areas where this cross-border commuting is stronger. If they exist, you should include in full in the border program, but then complement all this information with existing cross-border natural protected areas. If they exist, you should include it also afterwards, and also the existing cross-border entities that are already operating in the cross-border program, existing cross-border cultural affinities, and also, you know, if possible, try to align as much with existing administrative delimitation, because in the end, Natalie will ask everybody, we want impacts, we want results, so you need data. If you don't have this alignment, you can never do this. So this is my advice.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Jean. Right now, we just listened to Eduardo Medeiros, who gave us a broad view of functional areas, but now we would like to go a bit more specific, more focused. So we would like to listen to Jean Perroni, who is Director General of the Mission Opérationnelle Transfrontalière, MOT. Hi, Jean.
Hello.
So,
hello,
bonjour. The floor is yours, so you could give us a more specific focus on what we heard already and explaining a little bit more about the notion of territorial scales, please.
Thank you very much. So welcome and hello everybody. So thank you for inviting me to give some ideas about this functional approach and about the scales of cooperation in a cross-border area. First, I would like to come back a little bit on the issue of what is a functional area. It is related to a function. For instance, a water catchment area is related to water management, or a travel to work area is related to mobility. And these functional areas, they are characterized by interdependencies, by flows, and sometimes these flows go across administrative or even national borders. It's obviously the case, for instance, for an agglomeration like Geneva, which suburbs are located in France. And in that case, you have to consider the functional urban area, which is cross-border. And so the point is, these functional areas, they differ from institutional areas, which are limited by borders. And there is a potential conflict between institutional and functional approaches. So if we go a little more in this exploration of these two different sorts of areas, on this slide, you see at the left of the slide the old classical system of territorial governments. If you take the slide at the left from the bottom up, you have in every country local authorities that are themselves often located within regions, and in any case, everything is contained by central states, by our classical national states, like Russian dolls. Everybody knows that, and it's the classical framework for action. But on the right of the slide, you have something new, which is these functional areas. And again, if you take things from the bottom to the top, you have things like metropolitan areas or cross-border territories that go across the limits of territorial institutions. You have also the cross-border regions or the macro regions. And on the top of the slide, in the right part of the slide, you have Europe, which is itself a rather complex functional organization, which has different patterns if you consider Euro or Schengen or all sorts of functions. And so we have to act in a world where these two systems coexist. And if you take what are the advantages and disadvantages of these two approaches, if we take the left of the slide, you have these institutional areas, and sorry, yes, in these areas you have in these institutional areas they have some advantages. For instance, they are the usual framework of democracy. In each of these local authority or region or state, you can have a democratic discussion about what is common good and how we take decisions. And in this framework, the cohesion is obtained by political identity, by collective interest, and by you have elections and you have people who decide. But the disadvantages of this classical institutional approach is that there are inefficiency traps, because sometimes the real places where people live, for instance, their travel between their home and their job, might cross borders. So the real territory, like in Greater Geneva, is no longer contained in these institutional areas. And so you have to think something different. And this is the right of the slide. You have these functional areas. And the advantages of such functional areas is that they are more efficient. They fit with the functions. And so you have there a cohesion that is based on economy, that is based on networks and interdependence between people and between territories. But the disadvantage of this functional approach is that these areas are overlapping, they are complex, and they sometimes might seem to be technocratic, and people are a little bit lost to live and to have to manage this sort of area. So in fact, we simply need both, and we have to act with these two systems. And this is where we have to find, we are all working in this context of cross-border cooperation, either the Interreg programs or the cross-border local authorities, and we have to try to find ways to go beyond the difficulties, and this is where we have to simplify complexity. And the point is how to involve institutions, local authorities, regions or states, in cross-border governance bodies that we have to create to manage cross-border cooperation and cross-border integration. And our proposal is to act at different scales, which fit the real problems of the people or the firms on the border regions. Very often, it's possible to define local living areas that are related to functions that you need on a daily basis. For instance, working, you sometimes have to go to work on the other side of the border. Sometimes you also go shopping, or you may use basic public services like an hospital, like at this French-Spanish border. And to define these local living areas, very often the functional urban areas are a good proxy. So you have to define these areas, which is possible if you manage to get data about the flows of cross-border workers or the flows of people using equipments, for instance. Generally, you have another scale, which is more a regional scale, and it's also possible to define regional living areas that are related to what we call higher functions that you need only at some moments of your life, like an airport or like an opera or a university. And you have also, very often, a third scale, which is what we call now macro regions, even if there are no macro regions in every part of Europe. But when you deal with trans-European transport networks or energy networks, when you deal with river basins or mountain regions that are sometimes transnational, you need to act at upper level, like the Alpine region or like the Baltic area. And in that case, we also need to have specific arrangements, and at least, even when there is no macro regions, you can have the transnational programs that also can play a role. And I would like now to take an example, which is one of the more elaborated example of a border. It's the border between France and Germany, and you have had a very early reconciliation after the Second World War, and you have had many cross-border projects and also a governance that has been developing. And what is specific on this border, but can be perhaps a lesson or an example for other borders, is that you have a governance that is rather elaborated with these different levels. There is a first level of what we call on this border Euro districts. Here you have the one around Saarbrück and the French territories that are a little bit also depending on the German center in Saarbrück. And you have the Euro district Sarre-Moselle. Then you have another Euro district which embarks as well north of Alsace, but also the parts of two German Länder, which are Rheinland-Pfalz and Baden-Württemberg. And this area is called Pamina. And then you have also another area which is well known with Strasbourg and also a part of Germany on the other side of the Rhine, which is related to Strasbourg, and it's the Euro district Strasbourg-Ortenau. And then you have another Euro district around Colmar and Freiburg, and there is the last one, which is the Euro district trinational of Basel, which is urban pole is Basel, but which suburbs are located either in France or in Germany. And so the Euro districts can be a place to manage local issues, how people live in a cross-border agglomeration, how they can benefit from services, use tramways or local transport. And this is the first scale. But you have also in this on this French-German border two big Euro regions that also involve other countries. You have the greater region between France and Germany, but of course with also Luxembourg and Belgium, and this cross-border region is appropriate to deal with, I would say, upper functions like research, innovation, regional transport, and it's also a very useful scale. And you have the same idea with the Upper Rhine, which is a Euro region encompassing not only part of France and Germany, but also Switzerland. And in this Euro-region, you can deal with the cooperation between universities, the cooperation of research, also management of a portion of the Rhine Valley, and so on. And it happens also that these two Euro-regions coincide with the Interreg programs. You have the Interreg program Greater Region and the Interreg program Upper Rhine. And you have also on this border issues that need to act at a wider scale that we can call transnational or macro-regional, even if there is no macro-region in the narrow sense of European Union policies. And this border takes place in a transnational program, which is Northwest Europe. And it's an appropriate scale, I would say, to deal with high-speed trains that connect these cities of Saarbrück or Strasbourg or Basel with Paris, with the big German cities, with the Benelux, and so on. So it's also an appropriate scale to manage a number of functions. So we have these, in this case, we have these three different scales. And so that's what I presented before. And so to reach a conclusion, my advice to stakeholders and my advice to programs that think of their future is, of course, to think about the different priorities and the different sorts of projects that are often sectoral projects. It's clear that Interreg should go on to deal with transport or to deal with innovation or to deal with environment. And the point for these projects is to use also a functional approach to think what is the area that is relevant to deal about cross-border employment, for instance, or what is the appropriate scale to work on innovation. And on each of these topics, you can find data, you can try to find the flows and to design functional areas that are related to a specific thematic of the program. But the point is also that people are not only workers or not only engineers innovating, and so we also need to organize the collective and the integrated approach of these borders, and this is where it's very useful to define cross-border territories that could have a governance and that could have a strategy, like that we saw in the case cross-border areas that are that approximate the real life of people. You will never find a perfect solution because the different functions will always cross the administrative or the organizations that you try to design. But at least you will, in the future, you will be able to use the future objective about territorial integrated approach, and the objective 5, and also the future objective governance of cooperation. And these objectives may allow programs to have specific projects to progress in the field of strategies and governance. And I would just like to end by a couple of advice. First, there is no hierarchy between levels. Of course, a cross-border region with an Interreg program has specific responsibilities, but it has also to take on board the existence of local cross-border territories. So the local and the regional cross-border territories have to take account of what goes on the upper or lower level. It's what the German people call the Gegenstrom-Prinzip, the countercurrent principle. And in any case, there will still be borders. So you will, even if you create a new cross-border organizations, they will also have some limits. So you have, in any case, to cooperate horizontally with neighboring territories. For instance, a cross-border cooperation program has also to cooperate with the neighboring Interreg program. And you have also, in any case, to design and to work through a vertical cooperation between levels. So the future of the cross-border territories and the people that live in these territories is certainly even more cooperation between local stakeholders, between regional stakeholders, between states and Europe. So I think I should stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean. I think it was very clear. I could understand here that the different kind of scales will depend on the kind of interdependencies that there exist. So I think that the link between functional area and the different levels of multi-level governance gives the broad aspect of how territorial cooperation can work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.